Okay, let's get started. So, welcome everybody. I hope those of you who are watching live here on the stream are doing well. Hopefully, anybody who's watching the recording of this is also doing well, staying safe. Today's topic, well, first off, let me just talk about my stream schedule, hopefully. I've done a few streams in the past, and then I had a long break. So I'm streaming today, and my plan is to stream weekly at 2 p.m. Eastern time on Thursdays. So that's the current plan. Um, if that works well, then I'll just continue with it. I might just change the time. If things go very well and I continue to not travel, then I might end up streaming twice a week. So maybe one morning stream and one afternoon stream, or I might end up alternating and doing one afternoon and then the next week doing a morning, just so that audiences from different time zones can participate. We'll end up seeing, but the basic thing is I want to start streaming regularly. Um, I have lots of topics, and I'll talk about those. There's going to be some points where we need to wait for stuff to happen over the course of today's topic. So I'll talk about that. I'll talk little bit about some news and these kinds of things, during those spans where we're just waiting for some task to complete or in some install to complete. So today's topic is basically setting up a SharePoint framework development environment. And part of that process is setting up an Office 365 developer tenant. So I've got a Windows 10 VM here. It's almost untouched from its initial install. I've installed the new version of Edge, which many people call Credge, and I've installed Chrome, and I installed a Zoom tool called Zoomit, so I can expand stuff. And I have one zip file sitting in my downloads folder, and basically that's it. Otherwise, it is a fresh install of Windows 10. All right. So one other thing I didn't do it in here, but I have it because I'm going to need it, is I created a Gmail account. And it doesn't have to be a Gmail account. Any email address is fine. You just need an email address. So let me go ahead and sign in here to Gmail. And it is Rob Windsor test 984 at gmail.com. And I'm just the right password. Okay, so there's my Gmail account. I think should only be oh, that's right. So there should be a second email in there because I made this into a Microsoft account. So that if you create an Outlook.com or whatever, Hotmail or whatever the Microsoft variants are, they're automatically Microsoft accounts. For Gmail and any other kind of mail services you can use that are non-Microsoft, then you have to go to account.microsoft.com and then make that account a Microsoft account. All right, so I've done those things already. One other important thing is when you make it a Microsoft account, make sure that you put your first and last name in. If your Microsoft account doesn't have a first and last name, then you'll get blocked at one point in the next step we're going to do, which is creating an Office 365 developer tenant. All right, so let me actually switch over to Credge here. And now I'll just do a search. We'll go for docs.microsoft.com/SharePoint. So this is the SharePoint documentation. And we're going to pick the developer docs right here. And under SharePoint Framework, there is Getting Started. And the first item here is setting up your Office 365 developer tenant. Okay. And, oh, thank you. Sorry, I've been sitting here on MaxCam the whole time. So let me just show you what I've been talking about. I have my Gmail account here, so I logged into Gmail. As I mentioned, I made this Gmail account a Microsoft account, so you didn't miss anything there. It was just me opening up Gmail. And then I opened up Edge, the new version of Edge. You can use the old version of Edge. It doesn't really matter. And then I've navigated here. Let me just start that process again in case you missed it, because I do want it for the recording. So I'll open up Edge again and go to docs.microsoft.com/SharePoint. Okay. And then here on this page, I want to go to developers. So this is the developer documentation. And then over here in the left-hand nav, I'm going to expand SharePoint Framework. I'm going to expand Getting Started. And then we have a couple different options here. Set up your tenant and set up a developer environment. Okay. So we'll start out by looking at set up your tenant. And up here in the top, this text here, one of the links is to the Office 365 developer program. So this is how you can get a developer tenant. So I'll just right click here and say open a new tab, and it will take us to this page. And the Office 365 or Microsoft 365 developer program has been around for a while. And when you join it, one of the things you get is a tenant, and over time, sometimes the tenant you created is good for a year, and it had so many accounts, like actually at one point in time it was only a single account, and then it was 5 accounts, and then it was only 3 months, and so I can't guarantee you that how it is currently is how it's going to be forever. But currently, the tenant you get is good for 3 months, which is renewable. Microsoft monitors whether you're using the tenant for development purposes. And if you are, they'll auto-renew you for another 3 months. And then the same process happens in those 3 months, and so on. So as long as you just continually use your tenant for development purposes, Microsoft will continue auto-extending it. And right now, you get 25 users. So we'll see that after we've created the tenant. All right, so I'll click on Join Now, and it's going to ask me this survey. Oh, sorry, I need to sign in with my Microsoft account. So that is Rob Windsor test 984 at gmail.com. And then my password. Okay, so here is the survey. So what country am I in? I live in Canada, so I'll pick Canada. If I can find it, there's Canada. What company? So I'll just say here I'm independent. Accept the terms and conditions. Sure, I'll do that. And then click Next. All right, what industry do I work in? I work in IT. What's my primary focus as a developer? Developing custom solutions for my customers. What am I interested in developing? Applications for internal use, applications for my customers, and applications for me. What products? So I'm interested in Azure AD, Teams, Office 365, OneDrive, Power Apps, SharePoint. I think that's it. And what technologies I'm interested in? Actionable messages, adaptive cards. Yeah, sure. Bot framework, graph, identity platform, UI fabric, SharePoint framework, and tabs. And then finally, what platforms will I probably be developing for? So ASP.NET, C#, HTML, JavaScript, jQuery, Node, React, REST, TypeScript, and I want to check VB.NET, but it's been a long time, so I think I'll just leave that one. And then I'll click Join. Okay? So this survey is just for Microsoft to get an idea of what's the profile, what are the profiles of the developers who are creating these developer tenants. Okay? Now, the important part is after you have done that survey, that you then click this Set Up E5 subscription. Okay? So we'll go ahead and click on that. And it's going to ask us a few more questions. So what region am I from? I'm from Canada. What's the username? So it's going to create a single account right now. So what's the name of that account? I'll use Rob. And then what's the name of your tenant? So if I'd said here Vandelay Industries, then my email addresses would be vandelayindustries.onmicrosoft.com, and I would go to vandelayindustries.sharepoint.com, and so on. So I have a pattern I've been using. So it's Rob Windsor test 984, which is the same as my Gmail account. So this account that will get created for this tenant will be Rob at robwindsortest984.onmicrosoft.com. And then I need a password, so I will create my super secret password. And I'll type that in again. Whoops. I think I typed it the same. Yep. Okay. And then I'll click continue. All right. So now it's going to ask me for a phone number that it can text to confirm that I am who, well, I'm a valid user. I'm a real person. So I don't want you to see that. So I'm going to switch off of here for a second. And let me just wait. Okay, you can't see anything there. So now I'll put in my actual phone number. And I'll grab my cell phone. Just as an aside, I bought a brand new Android S10 device. Very happy with it. I'm amazed by the battery life compared to my S6. It can go with minimal, with use just in my office, so I'm not regularly using it. I'm getting like 3 days battery life out of it, so it's amazing. Anyway, okay, I think that's the code. All right, and now I can go back to here. All right, so now it's going through the process of setting up my tenant. Okay. So this is your dashboard. So this is your developer tenant dashboard. And as I mentioned, it's for Rob Windsor test 984.onmicrosoft.com. I've got 25 E5 users. It has 92 days left. So again, over those 92 days, Microsoft is monitoring the tenant. And if I continue to use it, they'll give me another 92 days or 90 whatever days. And so on. Now, there's these sample data packs, which are very interesting. I'll come back to those in a little bit. All right, so I am in Edge at this time. So let me come back over to here. So let me just close Chrome for now and then reopen it. And I'm going to navigate to office.com. Okay, and now I'm going to sign in with the set of credentials that I just created for my new tenant. So that is Rob at Rob Windsor test 984.onmicrosoft.com. And then my super secret password. And I want to stay logged in, yes. And I don't want the browser to remember. And you get this pop-up thingy, which when you work with this stuff a lot, I guess it's useful. Sorry, I shouldn't. I just create I have a lot of tenants, and I've gone through this a lot of times. All right, so you can see that these are the applications that eventually will be available for you. All right, so generally it spins up your email pretty quickly. So let's go and open up Outlook. Oh, it looks like this redirect thing. So I've been a little early. So let's just let that sit and work, right? So it's provisioning stuff behind the scenes. My Exchange email box, my SharePoint, the SharePoint tenant, other things. Actually, we should be able to go to admin. So let's go to admin and go to users and open up the users. And there we can see we have a single user. That's the Rob Windsor account I created a little bit earlier. And it will be a global admin. This account will be a global admin within this tenant. All right, so while this is doing its work behind the scenes, let's go back to our docs here. Now, another thing you need to do is create an app catalog site. You don't need to do that for the initial development. You do need to do that when you get to the deployment stage. So we won't do that right now, but that's the only other thing really you need to have in your tenant when to be able to do a full lifecycle development with SharePoint Framework. But right now we're going to switch over to setup development environment here. All right, and there's a video which walks you through this. So the first thing is to install Node. So let me just go to the Node website. So that's nodejs.org. Okay. So excuse me. Node is going to be basically our runtime host. It's going to basically our tools, our development environment is all going to be handled in Node. And I have another video on my YouTube channel, which is sort of like how to get started doing SharePoint development. And I talk about all of the sort of modern web stack and the development tools and all that. So I'm not going to get into that in this particular video. But what is important is that the current version of the SharePoint framework, 1.10, I can't remember if it's 1.10 or 1.10.1. It might be, it's one of the two. Only works on Node version 10, or sorry, it works on Node version 8 or Node version 10. It does not work on Node version 12. Okay. So what you need to do is go to Downloads and then go to, scroll down and then go to Previous Releases and then either go to Node 10 or Node 8. Now, if you're going to be doing SharePoint 2016 development, you can do SharePoint Framework development for SharePoint 2016, SharePoint 2019, and or SharePoint Online. So if one of the environments or the environment that you will be targeting is SharePoint 2016, then you have to download Node version 8, right? The major version being version 8. If you're only targeting SharePoint 2019, or you're targeting SharePoint 2019 and SharePoint Online, or you're only targeting SharePoint Online, then you can download Node version 10. All right. So, and then as time goes on, there'll be later versions, and then they will support Node 12, and then they might drop support for Node 8, and so on. So you kind of got to know, based on what version of the SharePoint framework generator that you're using, what Node versions it's compatible with. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So what I could do is pick like Node 10 here, and it will show me the distributions for the latest version. So that is 10.20.1. And I'm on Windows, so I would pick the Windows installer, right? So I would pick the 64-bit MSI, this guy right there, because I'm running a 64-bit version of Windows. And I don't do Mac or iOS or Mac development, so there would be a different distribution mechanism for Macs and so or Linux and so on. Okay. So that's how the documentation is described. That's how generally people will do this. But there's an alternative which I recommend because there's benefits to doing it and there's no drawbacks as far as I know, except for maybe a little bit of disk space. But usually that's not an issue. So let me search for NVM. So NVM, and then Connell. So Andrew Connell has a blog post which talks about using the Node version manager, which enables us to have multiple versions of Node installed on our machines and to switch between them. Okay. And so why would we want to do that? Well, it really depends on who you're going to be doing development for. So if you're a developer in an organization that's just brand new to SharePoint Framework or SharePoint in general, and you have no legacy, and you're not going to be bringing in code from other people, you're probably okay just using the current version of Node and then moving forward. But if you're like me, where you're a consultant, where you could be working on multiple projects, even projects that you didn't create, or you're regularly using samples off of the internet from somebody's blog or from a Git repo, GitHub repo or something like that, then there's some value in here, and I'll explicitly demonstrate that towards the end of this session. Okay, so I'm going to go to just search for Node version manager Windows. And there is one install for Windows, and there's one install for Mac. So it was originally built for Macs, but there is a version for Windows, and it's this one right here. Okay, so there's a GitHub repo. And if you look at the README here, it talks about the Node version manager for Windows. And there's the download link right there. So I'll right-click on this and say Open a new tab. And I want the NVM setup zip. So I'll go ahead and click on that, and that will download that. All right, so come over to my downloads here, and there is NVM setup. So I'll right-click and extract all. I'll put it there. I don't need to do that. Okay, and then I'll just double-click on the installer. I'll accept the license agreement. And next, install. And it's done. Okay, cool. And now I'll just go open up a command prompt. I could open up PowerShell as well, or Windows Terminal, or whatever, your flavor of command prompt is. Doesn't really matter. And then now I'll just type in NVM. Okay, it's just giving me the help. I can do NVM list to see which versions of Node are installed. There are none. And then I can use NVM install to actually install Node. So again, just going back to our browser, I want to install version 10.20.1. Okay. So that is NVM install 10.20.1. Okay, so it's downloading and installing Node. So that's done. It's also going to install the Node Package Manager, or NPM. So the Node Package Manager is what you use to install tools into Node. It's also used, like NuGet, in development to install or add packages to your projects. So it's used for both purposes. All right, so that's done. So now if I rerun nvm list, we can see we have 10.20.1. And if I want to use that version of Node, I can say nvm use 10.20.1. Okay, and now if I say nvm list, it will indicate that it's using 10.20.1. Okay, so this process is basically the same as the process of just using the Node version 10.20.1 installer and installing Node, right? That process happened on my machine. All right, so that's this bit here. And there's discussion about all the stuff that I talked about in this area. Let's install the code editor. So in these docs, I think this bit should be outside because we're actually installing Node, and then we're installing tools using npm in Node. And in the middle of that, we're installing a code editor. It doesn't really matter. You need to do all these things, but it just seems like this is kind of a little bit out of place. Anyway, that aside, let's just go open up the website for Visual Studio Code. So if you're not familiar with Visual Studio Code, it's a very lightweight editor. Oh, and it looks like, sorry. For some reasons, it looks like I'm having some internet latency. Sorry about that. But again, if you're not familiar with Visual Studio Code, it is a lightweight editor. There's no like project files like there is in Visual Studio. It's all folder based. So I'm just going to go ahead and download this guy, and I'm going to download the system installer, the 64-bit one. So I'll click on that. All right, that should be downloaded. Cool. So I can close some of these windows here, or tabs. We don't really need them. Okay, let me go to my downloads folder. And there's the VS Code setup. So I'll go ahead and run that. Accept the license agreement. Next, next, next. I want to check these two to add in open with code actions in Windows Explorer or File Explorer, and I'll click install. And this takes, 30 seconds-ish generally. Again, it's a very lightweight tool. Okay, we don't need to launch it right now, so I'll go ahead and click Finish. And let's come back to our setup instructions. Okay, so install Yeoman and Gulp. So we're going to use npm. As I mentioned, npm can be used to install tools. And the two tools we're going to install are Yeoman and Gulp. So Gulp is a task runner. It's not exactly the same, but you can kind of think of it like MS Build. So if I want to build my project, or if I want to package up my project for deployment, or I want to start a debug session, I'm going to be using Gulp to do that. And then Yeoman is the tool which allows us to say I create a project from a specific template. Okay, so it's a project scaffolding tool. So I'll copy this command to the clipboard, come back over to my command prompt. Let me just do a CLS here, and then run that. And it is going to install both Yeoman and Gulp. And this will take a couple minutes, not super long. So while we're waiting, let's come back to, here, office.com, and let's just check and see. Our email should be ready for sure by now. All right, so there's my inbox. I'm not a big fan of the focused inbox, so I'll just go ahead and turn that off. And SharePoint might be available by now. Let's just check and see here. Nope, it's still working on that. All right. So let me go back to the admin center here. And you can see there's just the one user. All right. And let's go back to our dashboard. And I'm going to install the user's sample data pack. So these sample data packs are relatively new as part of your developer tenant. And what it enables you to do is install, as it mentions, sample data. In this case, it's going to be sample users. So I'll click on this. And it's going to say here that it's going to install 16 fictitious users with licenses and mailboxes, including names, metadata, and photos. Okay, so it's going to. This is an Azure app that it's going to use to do this. So you need your credentials for your tenant, right? Right now I'm logged in using my Gmail Microsoft account, my consumer account. All right, so I'll go ahead and click Next here. Now it's going to ask me to log in using my tenant credentials. So that's rob@robwindsor_test984.onmicrosoft.com. And then my password. And now it's going to show me this consent dialog. Okay. So because this is going to install a whole bunch of stuff into my tenant, it's going to ask for a whole bunch of permissions, right? Because in this case, it's not only installing users, it's assigning licenses to those users, it's updating the user photo, metadata, and so on. When I install the other stuff, it's going to be adding in events and mail messages. So it needs a lot of permissions. So if you're not comfortable with giving this app these permissions, you can just say no and then don't use the sample data and just add it to the tenant manually the way you would have in the past. I'm comfortable doing this, so I'll go ahead and click accept here. And then I need to create a password. So this will be the password that all of the sample users that are going to be created will have. They'll all have the same password. Let me try that again. All right, so at this point, it is creating the users. So if I come back to here and refresh, it hasn't started yet. Let me try that again. If it's not now, I'll come back and refresh later on and we'll see some users. Okay, so it's still getting started. But at this point, we can come back over here to our command prompt. And at this point, Yeoman and Gulp have both been installed. Everything looks good. That's okay. That's awesome. All right, so now let's go back to our setup instructions. So the next thing is to install the Yeoman SharePoint framework or the Yeoman SharePoint generator. So as I mentioned, Yeoman is a tool that takes a template, and from that template, it creates a project, right? So this is the template for the SharePoint framework. So I'll go ahead and copy that command and come back over here and run it. And this takes a minute or two. So while we're waiting, we can come back over to here and just see if those users are being created yet. Yeah, there you go. You can see that sample pack is being installed. So I have this set of sample users that are now being installed into my tenant. So that's nice. Just note that they're all taking up a license, right? So I have 25 licenses. Once this is complete, 17 of those will be used. So just be aware of that, right? If you think you're going to be creating users for other purposes and these users aren't sufficient for those, then you might not want to do that, or you might want to create them and then delete a few of them afterwards. But I find, using these users for sample development, sample projects, generally works out just fine. All right, so let's come back to our command prompt. That is still running. So while that's running, let me just talk a little bit about. Oh, it's finished. So I'll wait on that. Okay, so let's come back to, and this is a little bit of an issue with too many tabs open. There we go. So we've installed Yeoman and Gulp. We've installed the SharePoint Framework Generator. Install a browser. I have a browser, so that's not an issue. And we're done this part. Okay, so we're done the initial setup of our SharePoint Framework development environment. So we have an Office 365 tenant. We've installed Node. We've installed the Node Package Manager that was installed when Node was installed. We've installed Yeoman and Gulp. We've installed the Yeoman SharePoint Framework Generator. We're good to go and test out our work and see, did we do everything we needed to do correctly? So right here is a link to a tutorial which walks you through building your first project with the SharePoint framework. Okay, so that link is available here in the Getting Started page. Right, so I'm not going to follow through exactly the same way it's shown here, but I'm basically going to do the same set of steps. So let me go to my command prompt. And let's go to my documents folder. So this is my documents. And I'm going to create a new folder called SPFX. And I'll CD into that. And now I'll create another new folder called Hello World. And I'll CD into that. And now I'm going to run the Yeoman SharePoint Framework Generator. So Yo is the command to run Yeoman. And then the template is @Microsoft/SharePoint. All right, so this is the first time I'm running it. So it's going to ask me, do I want to anonymously give Microsoft, anonymously give Yeoman information? So sure, let's do that. Let's help him out. And we've gotten to the client-side generator, so that's good. So that means that all the tools looks like they've installed correctly. So what's the name of my solution? Hello-World is fine. Which baseline packages do you want to target? Okay, so as I mentioned, you can use the SharePoint framework in SharePoint 2016, SharePoint 2019, and SharePoint Online. So let's say, for example, you want to build a web part and you want to use that web part just in SharePoint Online. Well, then you can go ahead and pick the first option. What if you want to use that web part in SharePoint 2019 and SharePoint Online? So then you pick SharePoint 2019 onwards. And if you want to use it in all three environments, SharePoint 2016, SharePoint 2019, and SharePoint Online, then you pick the middle option. Okay. Now, the earlier the version of SharePoint that you're supporting, the less functionality that's available to you, right? So if you're going to support SharePoint 2016, that means the only thing you can build are web parts. You can't build extensions. You can't build libraries. There's a lot of stuff that was added to the SharePoint framework that isn't available to you. Okay. With SharePoint 2019, you can build web parts and extensions, but for example, you can't build the extension that's coming up that enables us to interact with search, because that's a new feature, right? And then if you're only supporting SharePoint Online, you get all of the latest stuff that's available to you. So just be aware of that. Depending on what version of SharePoint you're picking as your base, different features will, a subset of the features that are available to you will be available to you unless you're picking SharePoint Online. So I'll go ahead and pick SharePoint Online. Let me do that again. Enter. Where do I want to place the files that are going to be generated? So in the current folder, I believe I did CD. Yep, I CD'd into Hello World. That's what I want, so I'll use the current folder. Do you want to allow the tenant admin the choice of being able to deploy the solution to all sites immediately without running any feature deployment or adding apps and sites? Again, I have a video which covers this choice. If you don't know the answer to this question, just say yes. It gives you an option that you don't have to use later on. So there's no harm in saying yes here. Okay. For initial development, if you're building a production app, then know what answer you should give there. But generally, yes is okay. For the second one, again, if you're not familiar with what this question is asking you, just say no. All right. So again, when you're building your first web part, just playing around, yes and no are good answers for these two questions. Okay. What kind of thing do you want to build? Well, for this demo, we're just going to build a web part, but there are three options here: web parts, extensions, of which there are three choices within extensions, and then library. Think of that as the equivalent of a DLL in the sort of .NET world, an assembly, or an NPM package here in the Node world. So I'll go ahead and pick web part. What's the web part name? Hello World is fine. That description is fine. And then it says which framework do you want to use? Which UI framework is what it's asking you. So the three options that are available here are Node JavaScript framework, React, and Knockout. So for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to choose Node JavaScript framework. All right. So while this is going, and this will take a few minutes, let's talk about the UI framework stuff. So this generator gives you the option of no JavaScript framework, meaning you're just using JavaScript, which is what the browser will run, but you're writing TypeScript, and CSS and that's HTML, right? So you're not using any kind of UI framework. The other options are React and Knockout. I guess maybe people are using Knockout. I don't know anybody who's using Knockout, but I do know lots of people, including Microsoft, who are using React. Okay. So React is a UI framework which enables you to build components which are separate from the thing that's going to be hosting those components. There's a lot of stuff, and actually React is one of the topics that I want to explore later on in one of my streams. But what if you use Angular Elements, or what if you use Vue or some other UI framework? Well, this generator, which is the quote unquote suggested generator from Microsoft, it's the main generator from Microsoft, doesn't support those. But there is another generator which you could use, which is the PNP SharePoint framework generator. Okay, so it's right here. So this is a community developed generator. And it supports things like handlebars and Vue and Angular Elements and so on. So if you want, you can use this generator instead of the generator that is the sort of again the main generator that Microsoft makes available for you. Okay. So just know that's available there for you. All right, so again, this is going to take a few minutes to run. So let me talk a little bit about some of my plans for future streams. As I mentioned, I hope to start streaming regularly. No, let me change that. I'm going to start streaming regularly on at least a weekly basis. And I want to cover SharePoint framework topics, so web parts, extensions, React, using React, maybe even looking into Vue. I know a little bit about Vue, but very little. So maybe using the PNP generator and we're looking at some Vue stuff. working with Microsoft Graph and SharePoint Framework, or just Microsoft Graph in general. The Graph Toolkit is something I'm very interested in spending some time learning more about. So that's one of the things that we could talk about. There's a lot of things in Azure. So Azure Identity, which is, if you're going to do anything with the Graph or any other kind of Azure AD secured service, you need to really understand Azure Identity. And I've spent quite a bit of time, and I definitely understand it better than I used to. But I still wouldn't say that I really understand Azure Identity. It's not a simple topic to grasp. It takes a while. So I want to spend some time talking about, what kind of authentication flows are there with the Azure Microsoft Identity Platform. So, for example, if I want to build an Azure web job that's going to run unattended, how do I secure that properly versus building an ASP.NET MVC website, right? Versus building a client application that's going to run in Windows. So how do I authenticate in those different scenarios? If I'm going to authenticate one way, are there multiple options of how I authenticate? For example, one of the options you have in certain of the flows is what kind of sort of password do you use? So you can use this thing called the client secret, which is basically the password for the app, or you can use a certificate. So, okay, well, if you do a client secret, how do I set that up and use it? Or if I use a certificate, how do I set that up and use it? So when you combine all the different flows with the different kinds of applications that you can build and the different options you have in terms of securing them or configuring them, there's a lot of stuff to cover there. So I think I will spend some time on Azure Identity. If you watch recordings of my previous streams, which you can find on my YouTube channel, where I talked about Azure Functions, I do talk about Azure Identity in there, Azure ID Identity in there. So I do cover it at a certain level in those. Azure Functions is another topic I want to explain, take a greater look at. I think there's a lot of value there. One of the announcements from Build, Azure Static Websites, is something I'm also really interested in finding more about. If you aren't familiar, let's just go search for Microsoft Build. This was a virtual conference that just happened. So if you go to mybuild.microsoft.com, you can watch the recordings of the sessions on demand. That's available for you. So at least one of the sessions, and maybe I can even find it here. Azure Static Websites. So static web apps, not websites. So you can find more about that there. So that's something I'm interested in. So there's lots of different topics that I hope to spend some time discussing with you in these streams. Working with webhooks, both in SharePoint and in Azure, and having an Azure function or an Azure web job or an Azure web API, handling those things is something I'd like to talk about. There's a lot of stuff around Power Automate that I would like to do some streams on. Specifically, one of the things is I just finished building basically a framework's not the right word. It's a set of workflows that combined implement approvals that can last longer than 30 days. So if you haven't done anything with Power Automate, you may not know that any individual flow run, any workflow run, has a maximum lifetime of 30 days. So if you have an approval that's all implemented in a single workflow and the approver does not approve within 30 days, then that will just die. But I know we have clients that have requirements for approvals that could last longer than 30 days. So I built, as I mentioned, I built a set of flows that together can can handle that and can implement that approval process. So I hope to cover that as just an intro to Flow Power. I always call it Flow still, but an intro to Power Automate and how to build flows and so on. All right, so our project has just finished generating. As I mentioned, it took a few minutes. Why did it take a few minutes? Well, let's go over to File Explorer here and go to my documents and SPFX and Hello World. Actually, let me go back a folder here and let me right click and choose Properties on here. And you can see that there are 437 megabytes or 498 megabytes, depending on how you're measuring it. So all that stuff got downloaded and installed on my machine. And most of it is in a folder called node_modules. So you can see there are lots of folders with different packages. And those folders have subfolders with package dependencies and so on. So that's where most of that stuff resides. Okay. So unlike ASP.NET and Visual Studio, the full version of Visual Studio, right, where you install the .NET framework, and it has the .NET libraries, right, that are all on your machine, and the project that you create in Visual Studio, let's say, for example, you create an ASP.NET MVC website. Well, it just has the implementation of the website, but the base class libraries and the .NET Framework runtime and all that stuff are already installed on your machine. Well, here, some of the tools are installed. So Yeoman was already installed and Gulp was already installed. And the SharePoint Framework Generator templates was already installed, but nothing else was. So it downloaded all of that stuff. So everything I need to not only run and develop, but like test, debug, all that stuff is here in my project. So that's something to be aware of depending on what kind of machine you're running. Now, I have a machine that's probably way, way too powerful for what I need. But I have like 3 terabytes of disk storage on over 3 different disks. So I'm okay. But if you have like an Ultrabook that has like 256 gigs of storage, then you need to be a little bit careful because every single project you create is going to take up around half a gigabyte of storage. So just be aware of that. I'll show you how to do the cleanup afterwards. But anyway, our project has now been generated. Let's go ahead and run it. So I will say here, gulp serve. So again, gulp is our task running tool and serve is the command. And this is going to do a lot of things. So the code in my project is TypeScript. It's going to take that TypeScript and transpile it to JavaScript. It's going to bundle the JavaScript up with CSS and any other static files. Oh, sorry, there's a step I forgot here. So let me just close this warning and close this tab. The first time you run, you need to trust the developer certificate so that you can use SSL. So that is gulp, excuse me, gulp trust dev cert. Okay. And if you've already run it and you run it again, it doesn't hurt anything. So if you're not sure if it's there, just go ahead and run it. And this will install the developer certificate on your machine just so that you can go ahead and run using HTTPS from localhost. All right, so now I'll go ahead and do gulp serve. Okay, so as I mentioned, it did the compile or the transpile. It built these packages that have like the minified version of our code in it. And it also started up a web server on localhost, which I can use to then test my web part. So if I expand the toolbox here, there is my web part, and there you can see, welcome to SharePoint, customize these SharePoint experiences using web parts. And then this is a property value. So if I open up the properties pane, can change that property value, and you can see that it changes over here as well. Okay, so this is my web part running in what's called the local workbench. It's running locally, completely disconnected from SharePoint. Okay, so let me just go ahead and close that, and then do Control-C here to stop the web server. And now I'll run code dot, or I'll type in code dot. Did I not install Visual Studio Code? I thought I did. Okay, maybe I just need to restart command prompt here. Okay, so cd documents, cd spfx, cd hello world, code dot. There we go. Okay, so this is Visual Studio Code. And I don't need these for right now, and I don't need the welcome page. So over here, where my project is, you can see I can navigate. Shoot, I don't have my cursor, so I'm going to have to just... but the source folder is the one we're going to start with here. So let me go to source, and then web parts. And let me just zoom in on that as well. Okay, so there's a folder under here. It's basically, since there is an empty folder, it's collapsed it. So it's really source, web parts, and then another folder called Hello World, which is the web part we created. And in there, there's this Hello World web parts.ts, right? TS stands for TypeScript. And that contains the source code for our web part. So let me just go bump up the font here. Settings and text editor, font, and let's go to 17 and then save that. There we go, and I can even zoom in from there. So here's the important bit here. First off, we have a class called Hello World Web Part, right, which extends base client web part of Hello World web part properties, right? So this is TypeScript. It supports inheritance. It supports generics. And then inside of that class, we have a public method called render. And this renders out the UI for our web part, right? So remember we saw on the UI, whoops, didn't want to do that. Let me just get out of Zoom here and then resume. So we have, welcome to SharePoint here. I messed that up, but you get the idea. There's welcome to SharePoint, customize the SharePoint experience using web parts. There is the property value and so on, right? So this render method describes the user interface for our web part. All right. So let's go ahead and make a change. So instead of welcome to SharePoint, let's just say here, welcome to Twitch, and then save that, and then come back to our command prompt and then run gulp serve again. So our workbench will load. We just need to wait till the reload task is run, which it looks, oh no. Okay. There it is. So now we can go ahead and load our web part, and now you can see it says welcome to Twitch. Okay. So that's the local workbench. We can also run in what's called the hosted workbench. So SharePoint should be ready to go by now. So let's go ahead and open up SharePoint. And we just have a single site collection, the root site collection. But for any site within our tenant, we can append to the site URL /_layouts /15/workbench .aspx, and we can use what's called the hosted workbench. Okay, so this page is hosted in SharePoint, and it enables us to not only use web parts that are part of SharePoint Online, but because this browser instance is running on the same machine that is serving up my web part localhost, it can actually render that as well. So there's my Hello World web part, and there we can see it running now in a page that's hosted in SharePoint Online. So were I to update the web part to use the REST API to connect and find out all the lists in the site, or do a search query or whatever, I could actually do that, and I could get data out of the SharePoint site or site collection in which the context I'm running, right? So in this case, it's the root site collection. All right, so with all of that stuff done, now we have proved that we've installed not only our tenant, but we've installed all of the SharePoint Framework tools that we need for doing SharePoint Framework development. Okay, let's just go ahead and try to do the last step, which I skipped earlier, which is to add an app catalog to our tenant, right? So if I go back to getting started and set up Office 365 tenant, we didn't create an app catalog site. So let's go ahead and try to do that. So let me go back to here. No, I don't want that one. Let's open up SharePoint again. And I want to go to the SharePoint Online admin site. So I'm just going to add in -admin. So robwindsortest984.sharepoint.com is the URL to my root site collection. robwindsortest984-admin.sharepoint.com is the URL to the SharePoint Online Admin Center or Admin Portal. So to create an app catalog, in the left-hand navigation, we click on More Features, and then we find Apps. And there is Apps there. And then we click Open to open the setup page for Apps. And here is the app catalog. And I don't have an app catalog set up, so the UI is going to tell me or ask me if I want to create a new app catalog. So an app catalog, it's basically just a classic site collection that has certain lists and libraries built in that can host app packages, right? So I'm using the term app here. So this technology was added with the SharePoint app model or the SharePoint add-in model. Okay, so SharePoint Framework is using the same, well, it's the same, it's not exactly the same package, or at least the contents of the package are not identical, but the deployment of the package is the same. We can use add an app to add a SharePoint Framework web part to a site collection and so on. So this may or may not work. Let me just try it. In the early parts of after you create a tenant, you sometimes get an error when you try to do this. Yeah, okay, I'm getting the error. So if you get this, you just need to wait a little while and then go back and try again. But I'm not sure exactly what the technical reasoning behind it is, but for the first while after you've created a new tenant, you'll get that error. So you just gotta wait. I've created I have another tenant. Hold on, let me just switch over to this guy here. So this is a different VM, and let me go ahead and just open up Edge here and go to office.com and then grab or open up SharePoint. Oh, yeah, thank you for this very helpful set of guidance. There we go. Okay, go to SharePoint. And let's go to Rob Windsor Test 985-admin.sharepoint.com and go to More Features and go to Apps. app catalog, and click OK. Oh, no, I'm getting the same thing. So there is, actually, here, let's do this. AKA dot ms/spfx dash training. Okay, so this is MS Learn, Microsoft Learn, and this is a set of training around SharePoint Framework, and there is getting started with the SharePoint Framework module here. And I'm pretty sure in here, yes. Okay, so there's an overview of the SharePoint Framework. So the discussion about all of the stuff, and then there is a hands-on lab that walks you through the process. So there's what I was going for. This is what an app catalog looks like, but if you haven't created an app catalog, you'll see this. Then you'll have a page when you navigate to that, which enables you to create an app catalog. If you've created any classic site collections in the past, you'll notice that this dialog or this page looks very similar, because really that's all you're doing is creating a site collection that just has some lists and libraries installed in it and so on. Okay, so again, here, let me just open up Notepad. You can go to MS Learn and search for that, or you can just go, actually, let me just bump up the font here to 18, aka.ms/spfx-training. That will get you directly to the MS Learn path for SharePoint Framework training. Okay. One last thing, and I'll stay in this tenant because I already have what I need installed, and I'll show you. Actually, I'm going to switch between the tenants. Okay, so let me open up command prompt here, and I'm going to do nvm list. Okay, so you can see that I have two versions of Node installed. I have 10.20.1, which is what I installed on the other VM. And I have 8.17.0, right? So if I open up a browser and then go to the Node website, so it's nodejs.org, and then go to downloads and previous releases, and go to Node.js 8.x, you can see that 8.17.0 is the most recent version of Node 8. Okay, so that's what's installed on that machine. Okay, but Node 10.20.1 is the version of Node currently in use. I can just prove that by doing Node-V, and we can see it's 10.20.1. All right. So let me go to cd docs, and then cd spfx, and then cd hello world node 8. Okay, and I'll open this up in Visual Studio Code. And if I open the file named yo-rc.json, it will tell me which version of the SharePoint Framework generator that was used to create this project. And you can see it's version 1.4.1. So it's an older version of the SharePoint Framework generator that was used to create this project, right? And again, as a consultant, I and the team that I work with at Pate, we've built SharePoint Framework projects for clients that have been in use for quite some time, right? So they might have originally been developed using an older version of the framework like 1.4.1, or perhaps even earlier, right? Also, you might find a sample that somebody's built that they haven't worked on for a while that was built in an older version of, built using an older version of the SharePoint Framework Generator. Okay. So now let me go here and just do a gulp build. Oh, sorry. I know why that's okay. Shoot. All right. I'm not going to be able to get around this. So why is it giving me that error? It's giving me that error because I cleaned the project. So let me go to Documents, SPFX, Hello World Node 8. Notice there is no Node Modules folder. Okay. So I explicitly deleted that because I wanted to zip this up and save it. So, excuse me. So what I need to do is now do an npm install to restore the Node Modules folder. And if you watch, as this is running, the Node Modules folder will show up again, and it's going to populate it. So there's the Node Modules folder, and if I expand that, we'll eventually see a whole bunch of folders get created in there. Right. So if you want to, packet or zip, like say zip up and give to one of your colleagues. I mean, if you're working with your colleagues, you should be putting this in source control. And the git ignore will ignore the node module, so that won't go into your source control, assuming you're using Git or a Git variant. But whatever source control system you have should have some kind of ignore file which says don't actually copy the node modules up into source control. But let's say, for example, I want to put this on my blog, and for some reason I don't want to use like GitHub or some other repository to do that. Then what I want to do is remove the node modules folder. All right, so while this is running, let me switch back over to the other VM and come back to code here. And let me just do a Control-C to stop the web host. And let's go to Documents, SPFX, Hello World, and there's the node modules folder. Okay, now I could use Windows to delete it. But if I do that, the node modules folder is, let's see, it is 497 megabytes. It contains 6,100 folders and 52,000 files. So you know what's going to happen if I click on that and choose delete. Windows is going to sit there and say, calculating how much storage their files are and folders, and I could go get dinner and see a movie and come back and maybe it might be ready to start deleting. And I don't want that, right? So what I can do is install a tool called RimRaf here through the Node Package Manager. So it's npm install RIMRAF. Okay, and this installs really quickly. And then what I can use this command line tool to go ahead and delete the node modules folder. And it doesn't do all of that, stuff that Windows likes to do when you try to delete something that has lots of folders and lots of files in it. Okay, so as I mentioned, this generally installs relatively quickly. Oh shoot, I meant to add the /g switch. So that should have been in /g to install that globally rather than installing it specifically in this project. But it should still run fine. So now I can do rimraf space node underscore modules. No, I do need to install it. My bad. Let me just add the -g switch and try that again. Okay, rimraf node underscore modules. Okay, so now it's just going to go ahead and delete that folder and all the subfolders. Okay. So that is a tool that I highly recommend that you use. I mentioned how much disk space that these projects take up. If you don't want to delete the whole project from your machine, you can just go ahead and delete the node modules folder, and that will that will remove most of the space that's used by by the project. All right, so let's come back over to here. Nope, that npm install is still running. So let's come back over to here. All right, so I've got two things still running. So while both of these are running, let me, one final thing. Oh, it just finished here. So rimraft node modules, you can see that got deleted right there, right? So on the other machine, let me just do this, nvm list. You can see that this just has the one version of Node installed, right? So if I wanted to have both versions, I would, on this machine, I would now do nvm install 8.17.0. That would install 8.17. And then what I need to do is, after I've done that, I need to switch to 8.17 and install Yeoman, install Gulp, and install the Yeoman SharePoint Framework Generator. Okay, so if I have if I have 3 different versions of Node, and I want to do SharePoint Framework development in all of them, I need to install Yeoman and Gulp and the SharePoint Framework Generator in all of them. Okay, so that's something really important to understand. All right, so hopefully back over here. Okay, it's almost done. And you can see all the folders in the Node modules got installed. There we go. All right, so again, I'm going to do node-v. So I'm using 10.20.1, right? And now if I do a gulp build, oh, it worked. And that is not what I expected at all. Oh, sorry. It's because I did it. Okay, so I messed up this demo. My apologies. So depending on what version of the SharePoint Framework Generator was used to create the project, when you try to do an npm install or when you try to do a gulp build, it'll fail. And that's because the version of the framework that the project was generated from doesn't support the current version of Node that you're using, right? So what you need to do is switch back to an older version of Node. So I completely borked that demo. My apologies. But what I wanted to show you was that I would get a build error, and that I could then use NVM, switch back to, so I could go node NVM use 8.17.0, and then do the build, and then that would fix the problem, because it's now using a version of Node that's supported for that version of the SharePoint framework. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why I like to have the Node version manager, is that way if I'm working on a project that was created using an older version of the SharePoint Framework Generator, where I can't just do delete the Node modules and reinstall and that will fix it, that switching to an older version of Node will work. And as time goes on, we're in 1.10 or 1.10.1 right now, but let's say, for example, we're at Node 3.5, where there's all these legacy versions, sorry, not Node, SharePoint Framework, 3.5. So there's all these legacy versions of the SharePoint Framework out there, and packages that were created using, or projects that were created using those legacy versions. This will become more and more important. So as I mentioned, I'm not aware of any drawbacks other than a small access or small additional use of your disk space. So I highly recommend using the Node version manager rather than just installing a specific version of Node using the Node installer. All right, so that's everything I wanted to cover today. So there was one last thing I wanted to mention. I talked about all the different topics that I'm interested in talking about in future streams. If you have any out of the list that I mentioned, if there's any that interest you, just let me know. You can put it in chat, or you can ping me on Twitter. Let me actually switch over to to here, so you can see there's my, in the bottom right, you can see my my Twitter handle. It's at Rob Windsor. You can also see my channel in YouTube. It's Toronto Geek. So all the recordings of my Twitch streams, at least the ones that make sense to keep. If I just do like an exploratory stream, maybe I won't put it on YouTube. But like I'll definitely put the recording of this stream on YouTube, so you can see those. Once I get partnered, I think the streams, the recordings of the stream stay longer here in Twitch. But right now, I believe it's like a week or 2 weeks that they stay here on, are available here on Twitch. So you can watch them here if they're still available. If not, you can go over to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching this, and I hope you got some value out of it. And I hope to see you next Thursday. I'm not sure what the topic's going to be. I'll tweet that out. Might be React. I think I might look at React, or I might look at the Azure Static website. It's one of those two. I'm not exactly sure right now. So enjoy your weekend. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon.